Greetings, Worship Leadership, Spring 2017. Today is February 15th. I hope if you're married or involved in a biblically healthy relationship that you remembered yesterday was Valentine's Day. I did remember it was Valentine's Day. When you're married as long as I am, one of the first things you can do is if the kitchen is a disaster, like help with that before you leave. So I have not always done great on the kitchen thing. I'm still not, as James 1 says, I haven't reached full maturity in that area of my life, but I would advise any of you that are married to help your wife in the kitchen. Like, just do it. Just do it. I don't care if you never saw that done growing up, just get over it and help. So anyway, I hope everybody's having a good week. I like to start these meetings with asking you if you have any questions. Okay, we're kind of starting to get to crunch time. You've got coming up fairly soon a design and an observation due. And let me just explain to you, we originally used to have that stuff due at the very end of the semester. Our goal, now this is a lot of people in this class, but our goal is to get you some feedback on one design and one observation before the rest are due. So that's why I've had to open up those later units, okay? But I can tell you this. Let me mention a couple of things that might be helpful for everybody. The worship assessment is designed to get you ready to do an observation. Now, this semester could change. I think the assessment is under the purview of preaching. But if the past is any indicator, for most everybody who turns that assessment in on time, they usually get a good grade on that. Like, it's not rocket science on that. The issue is this: the better your assessment is designed, the easier the observation is. If you've got a really good assessment tool, your observations are going to be a lot easier. And you need to be thinking in taxonomic structures. Okay, so at the graduate level, I like to tell students at the undergraduate level, Jonathan, remind me, what was your undergrad in at USM?
History.
Okay, so at the undergrad level, like maybe the word taxonomy came up in a science class, but if you're a history major, we just shove a taxonomy down your throat. You know, it's like, here it is. We don't even explain what the word means, okay? At the graduate level, you begin to understand that you're supposed to collect different taxonomies. My favorite example of this is when I took Bob Stewart for systematic. One of the great things about teaching at NOBTS, I knew this when I came in. I've never been required to take a class, but I get to take classes here, so I love to sign up for a class when I can. And when I took Dr. Stewart for systematic, he told us on day one that I'm giving you Grudem's textbook for you to process, but my lectures are going to be Erickson's textbook because I studied with him. Of course, it's also just Stewart, okay, which is great in and of itself. So he gave us two taxonomies, right? His textbook was one taxonomy, and the lectures were another taxonomy. Okay, and at the graduate level, you're supposed to be collecting taxonomy. Sometimes you have to read 2 and 3 and 4 books. You know, that's a lot of times that's why we'll have you do a book review so that you can compare somebody else's perspective on the subject matter with the lectures in the primary textbook. So it's similar in this class that, you know, you could say your primary taxonomy is the textbook by Sharp and Smith, by Sharp and Argel Smith, okay? And then you've got this other taxonomy that's more related to style. That's that Spectrum's book that you're doing a book review on. But then I'm giving you an expanded taxonomy or a distinct taxonomy. Phelps is really giving you an expanded, detailed taxonomy of things like biblical theology of worship, those kind of things. But say my taxonomy, for example, hopefully both you guys caught at the end of chapter 2 of unit 1's information. Chapter 1, if you didn't catch this, was mainly philosophical. It's just to get to thinking, even for a lost person, not that they can actually worship because they don't know Jesus, but what we mean by worship if they had a similar emotional experience, which is not genuine worship because they don't have a relationship with God, but if they had some kind of spiritual experience, what would we call that, and how is it defined? And I kind of took you back and forth. Where can those things occur as a Christian? Well, they can occur in any setting, as long as it's Christ honoring. And then when chapter 2, we really get into the nuts and bolts of this class is about corporate worship leadership. Okay. And what are the foundations of that? And there are 5 foundations that I suggest. Now, this is Woodward's taxonomy, but that question could come back at the end, so you want to be aware of it. Biblical, theological, so biblical, theological, historical, biblical, theological, historical, cultural considerations, and aesthetic considerations. Biblical, theological, historical, cultural considerations, aesthetic considerations. So that's my taxonomy. So when you're all of that is to say this: when you go to build your assessment, this is a lot of stuff floating around in your brain, hopefully at this point, where you need to make sense of this. Now, you could take my taxonomy, and that might be the structure. My taxonomy might be the structure for your assessment. To use the taxonomy I've given you might be the structure for your assessment. Or you might say, you know what? I think I'm going to take that Sharp-Smith taxonomy of, and what's his taxonomy, Jonathan? Well, it's aesthetic, kinesthetic, blended. So now to me, they're really talking about more than style. To me, they take you a little deeper than the other book, because they're saying aesthetic represents a whole history of how we do worship, that it's connected to the liturgical models. And we do have Baptist churches. In fact, right now we've got Baptist churches returning to this. Yeah. You guys may or may not be aware, like Paige Brooks, one of the most successful church plants in town. He's very much a student of the Weber model, which is really just looking at the ancient models of liturgy. They're doing Lord's Supper every week. He's thinking very liturgically. And so I would say what Paige is doing is probably aesthetic. It's kind of and also sometimes what we end up seeing is kind of a hybrid. So some of you might go to Paige's church because he emphasizes multicultural, and you might say, I think this is aesthetic because I see a clear liturgy, but it also feels kind of kinesthetic to me because he's really emphasizing multicultural. There's even been movement sometimes in some of his worship services from the platform that you're encouraged to go along with clapping and singing and different. So when I think multicultural, especially if it's more of an African tradition, which is what I know when the Solmas were leading out there, that it was more of that influence. Well, that might make you think kinesthetic. So, certainly you may observe something that goes beyond your structure, but the better assessment you have, the easier your observation is going to be to write. If you create a really good assessment, you're just going to answer those questions as you're watching, and man, you could go home that night and type up your observation. And as long as you've got the minimum word count, turn it in on time. All I can tell you is in the past, people who turn things in on time and meet the word count and don't plagiarize, they usually do pretty well in the class. So, just stay on top of those things. And then your design, hopefully, is coming out of all of these reflections and observations and collecting these taxonomies to say, when I design aesthetic, in my side of the class, my grader will grade the designs. So I absolutely want you on your designs to look at the rubrics. Okay, if you've not looked at that, both of you guys looked at the rubrics?
I have not yet.
Okay, so Jonathan, all you got to do is go to the assignments part of the page in Blackboard. I can show you that at the end. I hate to share the screen because what we've learned with Blue Jeans is once we share the screen, we can never return. Okay, it's like, the warp speed does not get us back into this universe. So I'll say that if you need to, but it's pretty simple. You just go to the assignments, and if you click on, say, aesthetic design, you just click on view rubric. Okay, And I'm pretty sure I took everybody through that. If you want to go back and watch the last Blue Jean meeting I did, I took everybody through that, showed them how to do that. Just look at view rubric, and there's the rubric. It's going to pop up. It's going to show you exactly what we want. So, for example, on the aesthetic design, to get the highest score, guys, on aesthetic design, it specifically tells you that, so it's kind of an advantage if you're really paying attention to what I'm saying right now. It specifically tells you 3 historical references. I want 3 historical references. Now, it doesn't mean you couldn't get a decent grade, but to get the top grade. Now, what do I mean by that? I do not mean I remember my grandma singing What a Friend That We Have in Jesus when I was little. I also, when I say historical, sometimes we are gracious about this, but increasingly we are not giving credit for a biblical historical example. Here's why. Of course, the Bible's most important. I've already said Bible's your number one foundation. But when we say historical, we're saying, are you looking at Western history, particularly, and using that to help you with how you want to design worship? Now, what you could do, you could tell me something about a hymn. That would be fine. If you wanted to say, I'm using an Isaac Watts hymn. I think the greatest hymn ever written, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. Isaac Watts lived in such and such time. He really made the English hymn what it is today. He's really largely responsible for that. Hey, that could be your historical reference. That would be fine. Okay, you could do that for a hymn. That's one way to do a historical reference, and you can find a lot of that information even online and whatnot. I don't require a lot of super in-depth research to make these historical references. You could reference something from these lectures that are in this week's unit. I've got history lectures on this week's unit, Unit 3. You could reference something from there. So, for example, in a kid aesthetic design, one of the things I really emphasize, guys, and there's a little bit of debate. I would even disagree with some of my Baptist brethren on this, okay? We all agree the Bible should be our model. And I think most of us would say a passage like Isaiah 6. If there's anything that tells us something about a liturgy, it's Isaiah 6. Where I might disagree with some of my Baptist brethren who have been, now guys, when I say Weber has been influential, like it would be hard for either of you to grasp how influential Weber has been. Your state leaders, who are like the mentors, pastors to the people in your state, in just about every state in the South, the state leaders either did their doctorate with Weber, or Weber was a very important aspect of their training in every single Southern state. And I am aware and appreciate that, by the way, okay? I'm just making you aware of that. So, for example, Weber really does believe, watch this carefully, and I say this in the lectures, so I'm getting into a little history here, but it's related to the designs. Weber really does believe that you can get from the first century original Christian worship, which we know you would have added, of course, celebration of resurrection, to something like a synagogue model. He believes there's a linear path from that to our earliest known Western liturgy. There's a gap of about 100 years because the church was so persecuted between the biblical canon and our first evidence of Western liturgy. There's a little bit of a gap. Guys, let me pause for just a second because I need to tell somebody in my office something. There is a card catalog that Gracie has access to that makes finding that music a lot simpler. Oh, were there multiple copies?
Yeah, one.
Even upstairs?
The box was missing.
Okay.
But I happened to find it.
You could. Okay. All right. Sorry about that, guys. You're welcome. That first century, so what I was saying is your first century, there's a gap. Okay, let's call it gap theory. There's a gap between the first century and the third century or fourth century where we have our first known liturgy. The Weberites say that it's linear, Jonathan. They say, we know that we can trace this back. Okay? I'm suggesting to you, and I get what I'm telling you, and I say this in the lecture, but I'm really honing in on something that you might pass through quickly and not notice. The Oxford History of Worship says that the theory that everybody used to reference on this, that came from, the guy's name was Dix, okay? His research was just assumed. It was just assumed. Everybody just accepted it. It's like, oh, of course he's right about that. But what they're telling us now in the most recent, now, Oxford History of Worship, guys, it's a thick book. It is a well-researched documentation. And if you think about who's responsible for this is the Anglicans. So if anybody's got something at stake here, the Anglicans would. I mean, maybe not quite to the extent the Catholics do, but the Anglicans really have something at stake here. This isn't Baptist people that put this together. And they're saying, say that again?
Common Book of Prayer, right?
Well, yeah, that's an aspect of Anglican worship, but I'm saying in terms of liturgy, the Anglicans would be thrilled to know that liturgy goes all the way back to the first century. As Baptists, we wouldn't be as concerned about that.
No.
But even from in their own book, they admit that it's really hard to prove that there's just this single line of liturgy. And it makes sense because the church was being persecuted. You had the Lord's Supper done in one way in one part of Europe, done in another way. And it's even possible, for example, not saying you do this, you should do this, your church, that even materials other than bread may have even been used for the Lord's Supper in some areas, culturally. Only bring that up to say there is some evidence there was some divergence here in how the worship was done in the 2nd century, okay? So I'm saying to you, here's what I'm saying to you from a Baptist, New Orleans Baptist Seminary perspective. Your authoritative source is the Bible, period. The Bible, period. The weight of church history is simply for us to look at and learn from. Would it be wise to take a look at the liturgy of Calvin versus the liturgy of Luther and learn from that? Of course it would. Of course that's a smart thing to do, okay? But you don't need to feel legalistically bound to it, okay? There are all sorts of interesting things in those liturgy. Calvin's liturgy, he wanted an absolution after the confession, but the elders at his church would not let him have it. They rejected it. So Calvin personally wanted an absolution to say, you know, this statement over the community of faith, yes, indeed, your sins are forgiven. But his elders there said, we will not have it. So that's an interesting aspect of Calvin's liturgy. Like he wanted it in there, but he didn't get it. So all of these ancient liturgies are super interesting to look at. Now, of course, I would not expect you to say what I just said over the last 5 minutes for one history reference. You could pull one aspect of that out. You could say the research from the Oxford History of Worship appears to indicate that there were divergent models for the ancient liturgies. Thus, on my aesthetic model, I'm going to have some sense of liturgy, but there's also going to be a sense of freedom. Hey, that's a history reference. You could do that. Or you could do the opposite and say, this worship service is modeled, very much after Calvin's liturgy, okay, or Luther's liturgy. So just any historical reference is fine. 2 or 3 sentences, you substantiate it, and I need 3 of those on the aesthetic design. Okay, so that's how the rubrics work. You just click on those rubrics, and they help you know how to design your worship services.
One question. Yeah. I was looking at the website, and I can't find the rubrics. Where did you say they were?
All right, if you go to assignments,
okay.
Do you see assignments? Now actually click on an assignment, for example, aesthetic design.
Okay.
Click on it.
Oh, view rubric. Here we go. Got it.
Yes. You got it?
Got it.
So if you're watching this recording, just rewind back to what I just said and do exactly what Jonathan did, and you should be good. Okay. Do you guys have any questions about anything?
That was it.
All right, so I'm going to spend just a few minutes. We're not going to take a lot longer, just to emphasize a couple of things. I'm going to close this door behind me because there's a little noise. All right, so I just want to hit some high points historically since this week. Now, what I provided for you are some audios of me, just going on and on about worship history. As you might can tell, I'm pretty passionate about history. I have a brother who's an educator on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and he likes to mess with me about, if I get in lecture mode, get into that. I don't know if y'all have ever seen sometimes English history, like from England. Sometimes English history professors are sometimes made fun of that the particular way of history, 17th century, that sort of thing. So hopefully there's not too much of that in the recordings. We're just trying to walk you through the big picture of what's going on with history. So let me give you some big picture views. Middle Ages. You do need to understand clearly in your mind what's going on in the Middle Ages. I think as Baptists, that's so long ago, we don't always value enough what actually occurred. So a couple of things I really would want to emphasize. Number one, have at least a general time frame. It's not as though, Jonathan, it's not as though everybody wakes up in 1400 and says, oh, the Middle Ages are over. You have movements, you have philosophical movements that eventually bring us out of the Middle Ages. And I would not use the word dark ages because, it wasn't dark the whole time, and it wasn't dark for everybody. And there were some incredible things that came out of the Middle Ages, and it's just not really a fair description. I think middle is a fine word. You can use your own terminology, but middle works better than dark for me. So it's really the fall of Rome, okay? And Rome falls, and then it continues to sort of crumble. But when Rome falls, so we're going to say around 450 to about 1400 to 1450. That's a massive period of time. There's a lot of things going on. We're certainly talking about city-states and in government, geopolitics. We don't have large sections of land that are under one ruler. Generally speaking, there are exceptions to that. For example, England really begins to be a powerhouse. France really begins to be. In fact, if you look at old maps around during Pepin the Short's era or Charlemagne's era, the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, it's a massive section of land. So there are exceptions, but for the most part, you've got these city-states that are warring. So that's one reason we sometimes have the term Dark Ages, is because when you're going to battle every day, when you got to worry about going to war every month, it's hard to create a lot of art. It's hard to do a lot of reflection on the finer points of liturgy or whatnot. But it is interesting that throughout this period that at least one sociologist, Martin Stringer, and Martin would not be alone, but he has written a book called The Sociological History of Worship. This is a profound statement. Martin Stringer says that the liturgy is the dominant hegemonic of the Middle Ages. Now, that word hegemon is sometimes refers to a political leader. So like in North Korea, you could look at the leader of North Korea as a hegemon, particularly for that country. Okay, or Trump is certainly a very dominant hegemon right now on the world scene, whether you like him or not. I mean, that's just a reality. But you also can have a cultural hegemon, Jeremy. You can have a cultural hegemon such as social media. Some people would argue that social media is a hegemon. Some people might argue millennials, are a dominant hegemon right now, okay? So think about this statement. Martin Stringer is saying the Christian liturgy is the dominant hegemon of the Middle Ages. That is an incredible statement to get your mind around. They're saying that is the centerpiece through which you filter reality in the Middle Ages. Okay? And I'll tell you something else that makes that interesting if you compare it to what I said earlier about having divergent liturgies. You did indeed have regional liturgies until Charlemagne. Let me tell you what Charlemagne did to eliminate that. Now, England was remote, so to some degree they were able to keep some aspects of their liturgy. And Ambrose was so powerful in Milan that some aspects of the Ambrosian liturgy still exist to this day. But generally speaking, here's what happened in the West. Pepin the Short, Charlemagne's father, super powerful political leader, understood that if he really wanted all these areas to be united, he understood what Martin Stringer says, that the liturgy was the dominant hegemon. So he knew they all needed to worship in the same way. So he went to the Pope and they made a deal that to have this partnership with Rome, which of course would mean tithes flowing into Rome, that they would force the Roman liturgy on the French-speaking people. He made a deal with the Pope, and they brought in the Schola Cantorum. Okay, now this is, if you want to ever read about this, it's in lots of sources, but one that I know it's in is in the Grout History of Worship. History of music, I'm sorry. So even in secular, so like when I was at University of Southern Mississippi, this was in the textbook. It still is. It explains this in detail. That Pepin the Short brought in the Schola Cantorum. These are the singers, the wise singers, the teaching singers. They're not just singers. They are constantly available to the Pope to sing for him and to teach. In fact, you would have to think they probably got this model from the Old Testament, where the part of the Levites who sang night and day was so emphasized in the Old Testament. Have you ever noticed at the end of Nehemiah, do they have time to think about musicians when they just barely got the wall up? And go look at the end of Nehemiah. It says they immediately designated some of the Levites to give praise day and night, just as David had instituted. It's an amazing historical statement about the priority of worship, okay? In our building, if I were ever to be asked to give an account, that's where I'm going, to those Old Testament. Not just what David did, but then they reinstituted it as soon as they could possibly afford to do so at the end of Nehemiah. So that's probably where they came up with the Schola Cantorum that still exists in Rome. The Schola Cantorum was brought in to teach the liturgy to the French priests. Now, how do you think the French priests reacted to this? I mean, just take a guess. Do you think they liked it? Negatively. They did not, just like if somebody came into your church and said, here's how you're going to start doing your worship services. It's not going to go over well. If I look here, I'm from Mississippi. If I tried to go in and tell Mississippi, are you kidding me? They would throw me out. I'd be tarred and feathered, right? It would not work. So what we actually ended up with that we call the Roman liturgy is not actually a Roman liturgy. It's a hybrid between a Roman liturgy and a French liturgy. And there's all kind of jokes about that. You know, the prayers are too long because the French pray too long. You know, there's all kind of jokes that go along with that. That's a little too, artsy. But that's how it came about. And so that's one thing I really want you to understand, that the liturgy really is the dominant hegemonic. The other thing I really want you to take from the Middle Ages is, one time in Dr. Stewart's class, somebody asked, Dr. Stewart, was there ever a time when, the church fathers, the ancient church leaders did not try to integrate philosophy into what they were doing with church doctrine? And I'm going to reference Dr. Stewart on this. He's like, guys, this really goes back all the way to the New Testament, where Paul is aware of the philosophical issues of the day, and he answers those questions with doctrine. So what I'm trying to say to you, not that we would agree with what every person says after the canon. Of course, it's Holy Scripture. But after the canon, people are trying to reconcile doctrine with especially Platonian thinking. So it shows up all the time. And I would suggest to you that that's one of the things that messes up the art. Okay? Now, I am not saying, okay, now I understand as Baptists, we have some issues with Catholic doctrine. I'm not trying to get into that right now. I'm only talking about the worship art. I am not saying if you look at 11th century Western art, and by the way, I need to make one other sub point here that's really important. And I'm going to come back to what I was saying. I'm going to take just a short diversion. In the 7th century, oh boy, are you guys still there?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
My computer just went haywire on me. Give me just a second. Wow, that was weird. Okay, so I am not saying, or let me go back. In the 5th, 6th century, the worship conferences, 5th, 6th, 7th, even 8th century, the Passion conferences were held in Constantinople. They were not held in the West. The East was the dominant theological, artistic force. When I just mentioned him a minute ago with Milan.
Ambrose?
Yes, thank you. When Ambrose wanted to increase the worship in Milan, he went to Constantinople. He brought the hymn back to the West, and they had incredibly strong doctrinal hymns because they were dealing with the Arians in Constantinople. In fact, they would, on Sunday morning, the Arians would be marching to church singing, Jesus is great, but he is not God. And the true Christians are singing, Jesus is God, he is fully God, he is fully, I mean, literally it was in their hymns, okay? Their hymns were responding to the doctrinal issues of the day, okay? Now, I wonder if we don't need to start putting some cultural issues in our hymns, like, God has created man and woman, they should go to separate bathrooms. You know, maybe we need to be that explicit. Certainly in Constantinople, they were very explicit about what they believed. And Ambrose brought those hymns back to Milan. And in fact, there's this incredible story that there was a political invasion, an Arian princess aristocracy was about to take over Milan, and she would have been able to change the liturgy, and they pray and sing these hymns all night, and God protects them from this false liturgy. It's just an incredible story that is tied in to worship. So let me get back to the 11th century. By the 11th century, the best of Western art has been very influenced by the East. And so if you look at like these incredible paintings that are in the walls in Western and Eastern churches, know that the East had been very influential. But what I want you to notice with the paintings that I reference in some of the lectures is that a Giotto, for example, which is a late Middle Age painting, Mary does not look human. She does not look human. Okay, now obviously we would have some questions there about the theology of who Mary is, but fine, let's move on to Jesus. Jesus doesn't look human. So, maybe that's where we really have an issue, because we know we're going to disagree on some things with Mary, but Jesus doesn't look human. So you do, in my opinion, you do not have a fully incarnational Jesus. Now, I am not saying that the Catholics at the time did not believe Jesus was fully God and fully man. I'm not saying that. I'm saying their art, because Plato was too heavy in its combination with the doctrine, made the art, I call it disembodied. Okay, so the art does not look like a fully incarnational Jesus. Okay, now what is absolutely fascinating is that when Constantinople finally falls and all things Greek make their way west. Now, in our biblical studies department, they celebrate this because this is when is what's going to lead to Erasmus and getting back to the Greek New Testament. Remember, they'd been without the Greek New Testament. So one of the reasons they get the Greek New Testament back to the West is because when Constantinople falls, all of these Greek Orthodox priests come running west for refuge, and they bring their Greek books with them. They bring as much as they can bring. So that's the most important thing that happens, is we get a revival of the Greek New Testament. But the other thing that happens is there is a rediscover. They had forgotten about Aristotle. They had totally forgotten about Aristotle. So now we have a balance to the force, if you will. Okay, we have St. Thomas of Aquinas is where you see this most clearly. Not that he's the only one talking about it, but he has a Summa Theologia, which is the truth from above, and then you have the other Summa, the truth from below, which is coming from Aristotle. So he's now not just reconciling Plato to doctrine, he's reconciling Plato and Aristotle. And you have this famous painting that's in the Vatican where Plato's pointing up, Aristotle's pointing down, okay? And they're saying there is a truth from above, a truth from below, the sciences and maths being from below. And they're saying all of this has to be reconciled with doctrine, okay? So what happens, and part of it has to do with the technology from the painting, because you could do oil painting, but I think it's more philosophical. All of a sudden, within 50 years, between Goethe's Marian Child and Cambu's Marian Child, within 50 years, all of a sudden, Jesus looks real. He looks human. Now, what's weird about this is if you go another 150 years, Mary all of a sudden looks too human. I mean, she's looking, it's a little weird, okay? I don't even want to encourage a particular painting, but I just tell you, they take the humanness of Mary too far by the end of the Renaissance, okay? So all of this is to show you that philosophical movements can very much affect what we do in worship. So when we say we're looking for a true incarnational worship, we have to be aware of the cultural forces and be aware that we really can without, I don't think priests sat down, in other words, Jonathan Jeremy, I don't think priests sat down and said, oh, we want to create a Jesus who doesn't have human elements, because they believed Jesus was fully human and fully divine. But they ended up in their art with a Jesus who maybe does not appear to have the human aspects of who he actually was. So you have to be aware of cultural forces and sort of work against them. And then we'll close with this. As you move into, you could say Renaissance or the influence of humanism, understand the influence started with what I've already said. It didn't start in 1400. It started when Constantinople fell. All things Greek make their way west. It starts within the church. People are really thinking about these Greek ideals. And then that would have spread to the aristocracy. And all of that thought culminated with two super independent cities. Venice and Florence they do not pay close attention to what Rome is saying. It's kind of like living in New Orleans. There's Catholics everywhere, but it's Catholic light, okay? People don't wake up every day super worried about what the Pope thinks. So you have these two super wealthy cities that have the ability to really press the gamut, really press the limits with these new discoveries and appreciation for Greek art and Greek philosophy of all types. And that's where the Renaissance is born artistically, the revival of all things Greek. But it really starts philosophically with what we call humanism. And humanism starts with this explosion of new Greek literature, okay? Now, also keep in mind that some of our most important Protestant leaders, such as Calvin and Zwingli, really, even though humanism is a negative word to us today, if we think about when they were writing, they're more humanist than priests. Now, Luther's, of course, is a priest who gets things straight doctrinally. But we think of Calvin and Zwingli more as these super intellectual guys who are reflecting on these things and giving us a richer perspective of balance on how everything fits together, no longer just this disembodied truth. Of course, Calvin was a real fan of Plato and Augustine and all that, but he had so much more of a balanced view of all this. So anyway, that's just kind of a quick run. And then, of course, the Protestant Reformation is massive for what it does, and particularly because it puts the liturgy back in the people's hands. All right, one quick thought on that, and then we'll close. The liturgy was not originally designed so that people couldn't participate. What happened was, in their desire to make it more and more interesting. And a good example of that is a word called trope, T-R-O-P-E, okay, or troping. So what happens is there's parts of the Catholic, and now I'm back to the Middle Ages, there are parts of the Catholic liturgy that lend themselves to really artistic flourishing. And what they would do is they would take a psalm that would have originally been sung by everybody, and they would say, in their minds, Jesus said, I am the Word. So they literally see that psalm, Jeremy and Jonathan, as Christ. Because in their minds, Jesus said, I'm the Word. So in their mind, that's Jesus. Like literally, they think when they're looking at the psalm or they're copying, that's why they were so careful in their copying. That's why the Gospels were decorated the way they were. They literally thought they were like, pouring the alabaster jars, like they're decorating the body of Jesus. Now, we would say that's messed up, but that's how they looked at it, okay? So in the same way that you can actually look at this online, the ancient Gospels where the front cover is beautiful. That's our first examples of Western art, where they are decorating, in their minds, Jesus's body. The same thing happens with the music. They would add words or pitches and words, or just pitches. That's called troping. When you add that to a psalm to make it more beautiful, you're decorating the body of Jesus. Well, that sounds good in theory, okay? What happened, though, is it got out of control. And it eventually led to something in France. Why France? Because of Charlemagne and Pepin, because of those guys' influence. So this is 300 or 400 years after them, but it ultimately led to this thing called the motet, which is totally messed up theologically. You literally have French words at the same time as Latin words are occurring. Like you can't even understand what's going on. It's just chaos. I think Paul warned against that. It's just absolute chaos. But here's the lesson historically for you guys who are going to be pastors. Humanly, we are always going to lend ourselves toward making it more and more and more interesting. I think we're in danger of this right now. Okay, now look, I love the contemporary worship stuff, but we're in danger right now of making it so interesting. I'm looking out in many places where worship's happening. Nothing wrong with the words. They might be totally theologically sound, but the lights are down, there's smoke or whatever. And you look at the guys, especially, their hands are in their pockets. They are not singing. They are not singing. They're just sort of looking, they're just sort of, and guys are very visual. They're just sort of taking it in. They're overwhelmed by everything. They're not singing. It's so interesting that it has destroyed their ability to actually participate with what's happening. Now, I'm not saying it's as bad as the Middle Ages where literally the French peasant comes in and he doesn't even understand the Latin. It's not that bad, but we are moving in a direction where things are so interesting that we literally cannot access what is happening on the platform to participate with it, okay? Luther gave us a redo. He didn't, by the way, he didn't reject all of the old melodies from the Catholic Church. He kept some of the favorite ones, but he began to put it in German so that the people could sing it. That was the big deal. They're now participants. But you know what's curious, and this never gets talked about. Within 200 years in the German Lutheran Church, if you go to the high points of sophistication, to places like Leipzig, the same thing happened to them. By the time you get to Bach, and Bach's my favorite composer of all time, but I am curious about this. By the time you get to Bach, it is just special music. People are literally just sitting there taking it in. Now, we think it's not special music because we're standing. Okay? Because we've got everybody standing, we think it's not special. That's junk. If people aren't singing, it's special music. Okay? We're just having them stand and take in the special music. So you guys as pastors, you're really going to have to think about this. And here's the one other issue, and I can tell you this as an artist. As an artist, we want it to be interesting. It's never going to be interesting enough to us. So you have to figure out a way to mentor your worship leader to let him know that interesting is great. You can do that here and there. You can have a confession time and have people sit down and sing a new song over them, okay? And still call it worship. And the great thing about that is I love it when you do that and people all of a sudden just spontaneously start singing. It's awesome. But make sure they understand that if people are not singing with them, they have pressed the interest gamut too far and they need to rein it back in so that people are singing with them, okay? And there's a lot of counter movements right now to get that going. But I just want to make sure you guys are both aware of that as pastors and for anybody else who hears this recording. Does all that make sense, guys?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Do either of you have any prayer concerns as we close out today?
You can pray for just that situation I was talking about earlier today.
Yeah.
A student who died at USN. This affected a lot of people. It's kind of tragic. So
Absolutely.
His name was Cole, and it's the family that's affected is the Whaley family. They're from
Where
Mobile.
are they? What town in Mississippi are they from?
They're actually from Mobile, Spanish Fort, Alabama.
Wow. Okay. All right, Jeremy, do you have any prayer concerns?
Yeah, my wife is pregnant, so we're just praying for health, and it's our first baby, so just preparation and all that kind of stuff. So
Jeremy, I think we've met, but remind me where you're located.
I'm in Birmingham,
Right. In which church?
Shades Mountain Baptist Church.
Yeah, great. Yeah, we met on a previous one. It's coming back to me now. All right, let's pray. Guys, of praise. I asked you to pray for us last time about some details coming together with 100 and something Georgia Baptist ladies coming to do Crescent City Praise with us. A lot of those details have come together even this week. So I just want to give praise for that. All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord Jesus, I thank you for these two guys and their desire and willingness to be a part of our meeting today. Lord, I pray for all the students that we could give them clarity for their projects. There is that sort of necessary detailed work of just fulfilling the syllabus and moving another step towards graduation. And we want that to happen for all of our students. God, I pray that it will be a good experience in that regard for all of our students. But the more important issue, God, the reason they're at seminary is they want to be equipped to shepherd your people, to love your people. And we know that the priority of worship and doing that excellently before you and in a meaningful way that would honor you individually and as leaders for the corporate body, Lord, is of the utmost importance. So we do pray that you'll equip all of us, God, and even for students who may not think at this point they're ever going to be involved in corporate worship leadership planning. God, I just pray they'll be open to, number one, the reality that we never know how you may use us in future years. And two, God, just seeking to be excellent in all areas of our life. There might be a responsibility to lead worship just for a small group, a Bible study, or for a youth group. In all of these instances of responsibility, Lord, we want to follow a biblical model that honors you. Thank you for this time. And Lord, I also want to pray for Jonathan's situation and ministering to this family of this student, God, who lost his life. God, what a tragic event. That you'll give him wisdom to those at USM that are connected in any way to this with the BSU or Campus Crusade for Christ and others, for other collegiate ministries, God. Lord, just comfort this family as we know they are grieving over what has happened. Lord, I pray, I'm sure you already are, Lord, that you'll use this to draw people to yourself, God, that they could come to know you. I do pray for Jeremy and this baby coming in the preparation, that this will be exciting and fun, but also that the necessary details will be in place, God. And we thank you for life. It's precious. It comes from you. We want to honor you with that. Thank you for this time we've had together, Lord. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, guys.
All right, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we'll probably do another one or two of these down the road.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right.
Sounds good.